spear.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you.
Okay.
Is everybody here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, we're all here. So this is ANT 585-685, and we're all working on the commemorating Yemets project with Cowichan tribes.
Yeah.
And these, as you know, are the artifacts from the 1994 excavations, minus the funerary objects.
Yeah.
And we're interpreting these for the school kids in School District 79. And a website that we're going to look at a draft of shortly, right after this, that'll be on the internet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing.
Okay. Thanks for having me. There's a lot of really cool, interesting artifacts here. Even some of the ones that you might look at and think, it's sort of banal in some way. And where to start? Like, obviously these Ablator stones don't necessarily, catch the eye immediately, but for me a lot of these are interesting because I think that they've been shaped a little bit around the perimeter. So they're not just completely slabs, but they've got a little bit of like overhanging grinding, or it looks like they've been kind of broken up through percussion. Not all of them, but this is a good idea. It was more like the kind of whetstone that you would buy in a hardware store, so used for making ground stone and ground bone. But this particular style of making Ablator stones, of actually shaping the Ablator stone itself and not just using whatever, is a little bit distinctive of what, in archaeology we call Locarno Beach culture type, which is 3,500 to 2,500 or 2,000 years ago maybe, depending where you are. And so it's interesting to see that a bunch of these are not, I wouldn't say fully random, but are kind of shaped. On the other hand, there's this one here, which is, it's incomplete, which makes it hard to really say too much about, but its general dimensions, the fact that it's almost probably, oval or circular, with maybe a little bit of action around the edge as well as the surface, then these are artifact type known as handstones, and really not exactly known, what exactly you might use that for, but something that you find repeatedly as a genre of abrasive stone. And like I say, they often have some pitting around the edge, so it could be for like smoothing larger planks or something like that. It could be for if you're having to smooth and then you want to do a little bit of bruising as well, and then smooth and bruise. But it's probably something that you hold in your hand to use and put the action onto something else, whereas some of these you would hold it still in your hand and you would work on it. So kind of two basic ways of approaching these Ablator stones is, some of them are mobile in your hand to do the abrading with something larger, and then some of them are small and you move the thing on it. And especially the ones that you move the thing on it may develop kind of grooves and very asymmetrical wear, because your hand tends to move a little bit like this, whereas if you're going like this, you almost always are going to do the whole surface relatively evenly. So I didn't really pick one out. This one here is nicely dished out in the middle. So, that comes about through using this for, well, who knows exactly how long, but years and years potentially to create that degree of, that's a lot of gestures, right? That's tens of thousands of grinding actions. So it really, it encapsulates a whole lot of people's daily life, gets sort of transferred into these rocks. Now these, which again I haven't looked at super carefully yet, but hammerstones. This one's nicely blunt at the end. So these could be for a variety of things, and like I said, I'd probably want to look at them more closely. But let's say this one, which has got just a little bit of pitting on it, it's clearly been used. It's smooth, good size for the hand. And at some of our sites up in Haida Gwaii, we've got a collection, well, at Richardson Island, we've got probably 24 of these, and they're all very similar in size, kind of, the size of an egg. And we think those are hard hammers for making flake stone, at least in the initial stages. So if you want to start breaking into a bigger cobble of material that you're going to then make flake stone tools from, then a tool like this that fits the hand, and you can, because it's the skill in making that kind of stone tool is actually appreciable, and so you want to have something that, you can't just pick up any rock at any time. You want something that with your hand, so to speak. So at that level, you often find that they see a lot of use, and they develop a kind of handwear as well as being bashed. Yeah.
Andrew was asking that very question about these kind of hammerstones. Is would you just pick up any old rock, or is a rock, would it get used repeatedly and hung on to as sort of a favorite?
I think they would get hung on to, because I think you would, generally speaking, you would choose a rock like its most important attribute is that it's less brittle than the rock you're hitting. And I know that sounds like obvious, but it's you don't want to be just breaking your hammerstone. You want to be breaking the objective piece, the core, and removing flakes. So this one has been heavily used, and you can see it's a piece is spalled off. And like, my suspicion is that this would not be for making stone tools with. This would be hammerstone for other purposes, driving little chisels or something like that. Because I think that just by its nature, this rock, it shows it by having spalled, but also looking at it, it's fairly fine-grained volcanic rock. It's prone to spalling. So if you're hitting another rock with it, it's likely to spall. Whereas if you're hitting something will give a little bit, even if you were pounding on, say, a piece of granite that you could bruise up with this, it's not that likely to spall, because there'll be a little bit of give, because in this kind of pounding sense, then a lot of granites are actually kind of soft in the sense that you'll be able to crush the crystals apart from each other. So when you hit it, it's got a little bit of give. But if you hit this on something that itself was really hard, like a big chunk of dacite or something, chances are your hammerstone's going to break. Yeah.
My great grandmother used a stone similar to that for pounding cedar as well.
Oh yeah.
To get it so it's more fibrous. For,
right.
For clothing and things like that. Or
Yeah.
baskets.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. And there's this artifact type up on the north coast, these big, heavy mauls. And, I think people think that they're like the equivalent of a, like maul you use for splitting wood or making your firewood or whatever, but they're actually really blunt. And I think those are probably used for bruising wood and breaking its fiber down in the way that you're talking. Or pound, if you were to pound up a piece of wood that you then intended to kind of abrade down, it probably does help prepare that for certain other things. So
maybe the last really interesting hammerstone is this really long one. Almost looks like it's been shaped.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is also it's it's got a lot of very systematic pitting, along one face. So that's not a typical mode. So first thing I'd want to know is was this excavated with a machine? But it looks like old scars. Now it could still be maybe a plow skidded off it or something 100 years ago, so you'd want to be aware of that problem. But otherwise, if that's actually use wear, that's really unusual use wear, because it's each of these, it's had 20 individual strikes. So, but my take on this is it's more, I would think of this as more of an abrader stone, to be honest. you know, shaped Ablator, Locarno-esque. It's just a little more rounded, and it doesn't have a huge amount of distinctive pounding wear, whereas some sides like this, that's quite worn down.
Yeah.
Like, and that's flat. And the rest of the rock, you know, this side is flat, this side is flat. So I think that probably the action on this rock was held in this dimension and then used for something. Yeah. So those are cool. That's another little hammerstone. You got lots more ablators. You know, my favorite type of artifact, of course, groundstone celt. So, you know, generically used probably as blades of chisels or adzes, and probably, and you can just step anytime in, Tommy or anyone else who wants to chip in, but typically when we see them with this asymmetrical bevel, then we think of those as adzes, and then this would be the side that is biting in, and this is the side that deflects the wood shaving, and as a result of that, depending how recently they were sharpened before you find it, before they lost it, if you look, there's often like asymmetrical wear, because one side is really biting into the wood and the other is really just deflecting the shaving. So you often get heavier use wear on one side than the other. And if you don't, then that may mean that it was just sharpened, or it may mean that it was used as a chisel. So far as we know, there wasn't any use of like axes on the coast. So an axe would be, you know, hafted in this manner, in parallel, if this is the handle, whereas a chisel is mounted like this, and an adze is mounted like this. So at least historically then, it's all about the adzes and chisels, where adzes are good, especially for reducing volume and for making depressions, you could say. So for making, you know, for anything from bowls to canoes, hollowing things out, and they can be, you know, you can have like the elbow adze, which is sort of like this, or a D-adze, which has a kind of stirrup-like handle. So those are the two main kinds. Chisels then, straight handle, and you know, my understanding in a lot of places that the main way of cutting down trees, you know, big trees, if you want to cut one down, get a length for a pole or a house post or a canoe or whatever, then chisels are probably your main tool for doing that. So long-handled chisels, you can get deep into the tree, and you just go bang, 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 bang on this thing. Maybe you help out with a bit of fire or something, but chisels are, you can cut down a pretty big tree with a chisel, and it's a controlled way of doing it, you know, versus flailing around with an axe, which, I mean, if you're good with an axe, you're not necessarily flailing, but the thing is with stone tools that they can't take the abuse that, say, a steel axe can. So even with, I'll talk about this material in a minute, but you know, by precisely positioning it as a chisel, or by using a fairly controlled, low impact but repetitive adzing motion, with it being hafted in such a way it's harder to like misstrike, then the chances of like just breaking this thing in half or taking a corner off are relatively low. Whereas if you were to mount this as an axe and then you're swinging it and you're using the momentum of the piece itself to, you know, be the kind of dynamic entry force, stone tools will often, they'll disintegrate under that kind of pressure. So, you know, stone like this is great for chisels and adzes. This particular kind, this classic piece of BC nephrite, or so-called jade, and so far as we know, this raw material is only available on the Middle Fraser, and traditionally it was gathered out of river bars as river-worn cobbles. It's mined up there now, but there's no evidence that, you know, people were, back in the day, were getting it out of the hard rock because there was so much had washed out in the sort of Lillooet area. And then, you know, they have found in the past boulders of this stuff in, you know, at least as far as Hope, but they're much more common up on that mid-Fraser.
I found that in Hope before.
You did? Yeah. Cool. There's also a source that comes out of what's that river that comes in at Hope? The Coquihalla, yeah. There's a source of so-called semi-nephrite and serpentine there as well, and that it can also be used, but it needs to be treated with fire first. But anyway, so this is an exotic material in the sense of it's come quite a long way, and material from the mid-Fraser is, you know, is found all over, you know, as far as Alberta at least, and all over the coast, up and down the coast. And so even though there's other sources of nephrite now known in the province, there's only one that's known to have been used in ancient times. So this is a very typical from Locarno Beach period. You know, can't guarantee that's what it's from, but this period, you know, 3.5 to 2.5 or 2,000 years ago, kind of shaped the size, very beautifully finished. And this rock is so hard and tough, that is to say, resistant to fracture. It's got like a unique combination of being tough and hard. So most rocks that are really hard are brittle, and most rocks that are really tough are softer. And what you want, if you're going to be cutting something, is you want it to be hard and tough. And so this rock, this kind of rock, has an almost unique set of attributes that way, but what goes along with that is incredibly hard to work. So to make something out of this, like people that have done replication on this, that primarily in New Zealand, but also a little bit's been done around here, that if this, you know, if this was originally, let's say, this long, like to here, you could be talking about in full-time equivalent 8-hour days of doing nothing but you could easily be talking about 2 weeks to make this easily. And the bigger ones from the mid-Fraser, some of which are like this, those ones, you know, you're several months, if not longer, and maybe that's spread up into, you know, an hour a day or whatever, or maybe you have an assistant, so to speak, like, you know, a voluntary or involuntary assistant, but all the same, it's a lot of investment because that person could be doing something else. So, so these really tell a great story. There's been a really nice PhD done on them recently that traces the material back to the sources, Jesse Morin, and yeah, really nice PhD. So he sorted out a lot of stuff about this thing. So, okay, so this would be the ideal, yeah? But you don't always in life have the ideal thing. And so these can be made out of a lot of different rock types, but especially for chisels, they can be made out of bone, and they could be made out of shell, California Musselshell. In fact, I think I've got one right within grabby distance, if I'm not mistaken, from a different site. And you can tell me to stay on task if you want to. But let me just see. Because I saw this literally a couple of days ago, so if I don't find it right away, probably it should say shell on it. Here is shell, but where's the thing? Well, I'll just leave that for now. Anyway, you can, like Musselshell seems like it'd be a really terrible, brittle thing, but I think that there's information, and you know, when steel became available on the coast, it was iron, other metals, it was like hot property. So, you know, it has a lot more efficiency. People have done studies that say it's like 6 times more efficient for, you know, time, energy input to do the same tasks. So that's a huge, that's a huge input, right? That you can't, so, you know, so like even some of the first Europeans on the coast, they arrived with like, you know, the usual assortment of trinkets, but what people wanted were like, hey, have you got any iron? Have you got any iron? And so they would take apart their water barrels, which had metal bands around the water barrels, and which would be about this wide, and you know, nice iron, and the ship's blacksmith would cut them up into lengths, which were called toes, and those were like valuable. And of course the settlers were just like, hey, this is great because, you know, like this is the cheapest thing on the ship, but we can trade it. So so when it comes to the shell, you think, well, how would that even work? And like Brian Hayden, who you may have, you know, come across, interesting guy in a lot of ways. He tested the shell and he made replications of shell, and then he started just wailing away on trees, and of course it just blew apart. And his conclusion was it's useless. But that doesn't make sense, because you find shell that must have worked, right? Because people weren't idiots, and it worked. So how does that come about? In my observation is that they're almost all like still greasy when you find them in the ground, and they were probably soaked in oil. And there's a bit of historic information on that for bone chisels, where they're kept soaked in oil in like leather sleeves, and that way they maintain a bit of flexibility, and they don't get as brittle. And I think for shell it would be the same thing. Then you'd have to use it using the appropriate gestures and not your kind of wild Brian Hayden gestures, and that would help too. So it's a combination of knowledge about the material plus knowledge about the kind of gestures you have to use to effectively do it.
Whaling harpoons, the mussel shells.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
I've got an oil, or my family has an iron lance, like
Oh, yeah.
a killing lance
Yeah.
tip, and possibly done by Jewett.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
I think it's got the JJs, but it's pretty
Yeah.
rusty, and it lived in
Yeah.
the forest for very long.
I think, you know, in some ways that's like the ultimate testament to just what a good material mussel shell can be. Is they have found archaeologically a number of whale bones, especially like scapula and ribs and that sort of target zone, with the tips of mussel shell harpoons broken off inside them. So like this mussel shell harpoon tip will go in and just keep going right into the bone fairly deeply. So of course it would go through the flesh better. And you know, I have a bit of a theory that even if it disintegrates, that's not a bad thing, because then it's less likely to cut its way out. So, you know, as long as it goes in, and you know, harpoon only has to work once, right? It only has to work once, and it pays for itself.
One of the only shell objects we have is this beautiful shell bead here.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, this is beautifully made. Interesting in a way that like this is one of the largest ones I've seen. You know, a lot of shell beads are literally the size of the hole of this one, and some of them, the hole that's drilled in them is, you know, the width of a human hair, and it's completely a mystery to archaeologists how, you know, how did you make those? Yeah. And so this is made out of some kind of large clam, I would say, and you know, very skillfully drilled, and then the drill hole is then, you know, reamed out to make it cylindrical versus biconical. Because if you come in from each side, you're going to get things. So they finished both the inside hole and they finished the perimeter. So someone put a lot of care into this bead, and some beads are a little more ad hoc, you know. Yeah.
You were talking earlier about prepared shell, and one of the most interesting tiny bone objects in our collection here, I think, is this intriguing little piece of polished bone,
Mhm.
and it glistens. You can see it's really
Yeah.
shining from whatever work had been done with it, and then it's also burnt.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is really interesting, and on one side, it's completely, I think more or less the natural surface of the bone, but shaped a little bit. On the other side, it's still got a little chunk of the inner cavity or some kind of morphology of the bone. And to my eye, it looks like part of a deer ulna awl. So the deer ulna has a little modeling on one side of it and pretty smooth on the other. It's about this wide when it gets to the tip. And the ulnas have the notch, like your ulna does, has a notch which just fits the hand beautifully. And so these were sought after. And so takes some grinding, but it's almost ready to go as is, fresh out of the animal as an awl. And then, might break a little bit and it get resharpened and so forth, but just the use of it, so repetitively using it in and out of basketry, in and out of leather, polishes them up. So sometimes you find a piece of bone and it's super polished and you think, oh, they must have polished that to make it shiny. But sometimes also it gets shiny because it's just used and it was somebody's hand tool for years and then eventually broke, went into the fire. Piece of it went into the fire, like who knows, but I would suspect that this is use wear versus it being deliberately polished. Yeah.
Here's another maybe example of
Right,
a shape
yeah.
of an object.
Yep. Yep. So this one, even you can see it's got it's quite shiny on the tip and not very shiny down here. And that would be like the normal character of the bone, especially after being in the ground for a while, would be more like this, a little bit pitted, a bit of acid etching or what have you. So this is, I'm pretty sure, use wear, and it's been shaped to be like that. And again, it's a little hand awl. It might have been hafted, or it might have just been used in the hand like this. So use an awl for, making holes, and I think in basketry, and again, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of, when you're doing basketry, there's a lot of moving of the individual strands around, even after, then you kind of lever them to get them tight, get them tight, or push them through or whatever. So, I think awl, if you go in a hallway into the hardware and get an awl, it's almost exclusively for making holes in things. But I think awls on the coast here, some were for making holes in things, and some were for a kind of, basketry work, which is more about manipulating small bits of stiff fiber and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's cool.
So we have a fair number of these kinds of
Yep.
pointy objects, but also on the bone side, we also have a number of these guys that look like they might be from a toggling harpoon.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking at these the other day.
By side here.
Yeah. So again, these would be this particular style of harpoon. So, by definition in archaeology, a harpoon is a projectile that has a retrieving line attached to it. If it's fixed to the shaft, then it's a point. And so there's a lot of ways of solving that problem of making something that you can put a line on and then bring it back, because it needs to be on something stiff to go into the animal, and then the line needs to stay so that you basically put the animal on a leash. And this would apply both to, you think harpoons, you think marine mammals, but harpoons were widely used also on fish, larger fish. So I don't think these are a natural pair, but this particular style where you make two valves, so two sides of the harpoon, and they fit together, and the line in essence goes around the middle, and then these act as the barbs. This is called, composite toggling harpoon. So within the world of harpoons, there's really two kinds of harpoons. I mean, if we discount explosive industrial harpoons. But there's really two kinds. Ones that work by having barbs. So you stick it into the animal, and then it's got these hook-like barbs, and that's what stops it coming back out. So those are good, but barbs are also, you know, they're prone to breaking off. Like, it's hard to get a material again that has the strength to have the barb as being, you know, a projection that will go into the animal and then also stop it from coming out. So it just needs the right material. And land mammal bone is optimal for that. Antler's really good for that. But another way of solving that problem is to have the toggling harpoons. So a toggling harpoon head is like, you know, if you've ever had a duffel coat, you know, you turn the toggle sideways, you slide it through the loop of leather, and then it turns at right angles and turns sideways, and that's what stops it pulling back out of its leather loop. So a toggling harpoon head goes into the animal, because you have a shaft on it, and then with the retrieving line, which is called the lanyard, when it starts, so then you pull back on your shaft because you don't want to leave that, and you're basically poking this thing into the animal. Then when the retrieving line starts to pull back, because it's on the middle, it tends to turn the harpoon sideways inside the animal. So the whole harpoon is inside the animal, the retrieving line toggles it, and that creates then a very strong, you know, imagine trying to pull this through my hand, you know, and you can do this then with, you can do it with smaller pieces. You don't need to like work on a giant piece of antler, it's composite. You can put a nice stone blade or Musselshell blade. So the whaling harpoons were typically composite, and in that case they're so big that I think sometimes the valves are made out of yew wood or out of other material. But for the smaller ones, which could be used on smaller sea mammals, but also on large salmon, sturgeon, that kind of thing, probably these toggling ones are very efficient to make, and then extremely effective. Then sort of weirdly, they're in style in Locarno Beach, so 35 to 2,000-ish years ago. Then during the Marpole period, you know, the most overrated time period on the coast, they start preferring these large barbed points. So they have barbed points all the way through, and, you know, barbed points have been made by pretty well everyone everywhere in the world. But they start making these big unilaterally barbed points in Marpole, and then after that they go back to making these. And so that's really intriguing to me archaeologically, because generally speaking, once something that's distinctive goes out of style, it doesn't come back in again.
Especially 1,000 years later.
1,000 years later. Exactly. So, yeah. So I wouldn't really want to say exactly what the meaning of that is, but just to illustrate then, this one is what we call self-arming, so it would have just been two pieces. And that's fairly unusual style, so that's the bit that would poke a hole in the animal. But some of them would be, most of them probably would be three-piece, where you have some kind of blade in there. So these, the antler is forming the, effectively that's the barbs, because it gets turned, and then the strength of antler or bone is tremendously strong, tensile strength. I mean, that's what it's evolved to do. So it's super great material for this kind of thing, especially if you can keep it short. And then, but you've still got the advantages of something that is quite sharp. And then, like I say, if this part disintegrates or breaks, it doesn't really matter. Like, that's probably not going to happen if you misfire and it just goes into the water. But if it goes into an animal and this breaks, arguably it's even a good thing if it doesn't cut its way back out. So you would happily trade this for a seal or a sea lion or whatever, you know? Yeah.
Well, picking up that piece of ground slate here, it brings to mind that a lot of what we found at Yayemnuts was chip slate and ground slate. There's almost no conventional chipstone tools. What do you see here when you look at the slate objects?
Well, there's a lot of miscellaneous, like, because slate's a really super useful material, but it's relatively brittle in terms of it snaps easily. So, like I was saying in regard to that, like, the chances are good that if this went into an animal, and maybe it did because it is broken, the chances are pretty good that that's going to break as a result of being used. And so typically you see ground slate points being used primarily for marine mammals, I think for that reason, because otherwise, one miss and you're almost guaranteed to blow your projectile point apart. Anyway, so but it can be sharpened to be super sharp, and it's fast and easy because it's a relatively soft rock. So you can sharpen it either to make, a point like this one, or something like, which one was a?
Yeah, the kind of knifey one, the Ulu style, maybe that one.
Or
this one.
Yeah, a bit skinny. It's hard to, I think maybe that first one that I had. So we talked about the projectile point, its role, its pluses and minuses, but something that slate was also really good for is making knives. So it comes, you can find it in relatively big sheets. It's already fairly thin. It's fairly soft, so you can make even an expedient knife in a matter of minutes versus, weeks because you might think, well, it would be ideal to make a knife out of this stuff. And it'd be like, okay, full your boots. I think I've only ever seen one plausible knife made out of this versus, I've probably seen 2,500 of these made out of nephrite. So the deal with the knives is that they would, the classic sort of genre of knife then is a kind of an ulu. So semicircular blade sharpened around the edge, and then with a straight handle. And in fact, one of these eroded out of the Middle Fraser River at Scowlitz, and with the handle still on. So that's a really cool piece, and it was about 1,000 years old, I think. So you don't often, because of preservation, you don't often find the handle, and it's possible to use these without. But the general interpretation of a lot of this ground slate stuff that is sort of miscellaneous, not clearly shaped to be pointed, is that they're bits and pieces of ulu blades, and you'd probably go through quite a few because it is a softer, brittle material. Obviously if you knew how to handle it, that's less likely, but what this would be particularly good for then is fish processing, where you can have the fish, and if you're filleting fish or opening them up to butterfly them or what have you, then that action of the ulu in the hand, I think, is a particularly desirable action for filleting fish. And probably you could use it on game, but this slate edge is probably not super great for cutting through leather or hide. It was really good on fish. But again, it's Jesse Morin who did some experiments with this, and he found, okay, these slate blades work fantastically. The Musselshell knives work fantastically. The Cortex spall tools, which are like one big flake that's just, imagine that I could, cut this in half, and you've got something with a sharp, rounded perimeter, and then you have a dome on one side. Those are great for fish, and indeed in many parts of the province, what you find, at fish camps are just Cortex spall tools, just hundreds of them, yeah. But the point being that what Jesse found anyway is that even the slate knives and these other knives, they have difficulty getting into fish skin. So I don't know if you've ever tried to, with a dull knife, sometimes even with like a sharp one, it's hard to get it started. But if you make just a tiny little incision with something, then you can get in your big flat knife and it'll open up. So it's kind of hard to explain how that works. But you got to cut. If you break the skin, then you can be cutting sideways into the skin, I guess. And fish skin is surprisingly durable material, right? It's like it's a useful thing in its own right. These ground slate knives then are one solution to what must have been an ongoing, thing for people on the coast eating so much fish that, fish knives would be one of your most common needs. And a lot of different solutions to this, of which the ground slate knife probably appears about, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago-ish, as one solution to that. But even then, the Cortex ball tools continue. And the big Musselshell knives, which, I saw one here. This might be one that we made, but so a big California mussel, then all you really have to do is sharpen the edge. And because it's domed like this, it does that same thing. So, like I haven't cut a real lot of fish in my life, but one of the challenges with cutting fish is you want to kind of lift and separate, because you want that fillet to move away from the knife. And I think the domed knife can really help with that. Like if you're using a modern super sharp filleting knife, then you pretty much have to, or it helps if you lift the fillet as you go. And I'm sure that's the case also with these other knives, but if you have a kind of domed knife, then you can, that helps. Or if you have an ulu, which is very thin, then you can do that two-handed thing. Anyway, so it's just kind of a bit of speculation on exactly how you would go about using these. But in places where you have the California mussel, it's a fantastically useful raw material. And some of them are, literally this thick and massive and useful for making super quick and dirty knives. But then generally speaking, they don't preserve very well in the ground because the Musselshell in particular is a little bit more fibrous, and it doesn't, it tends to degrade and break up into little chunks and then ultimately into little fibers and turns to just a kind of black mess. This is part of one of those adze blade or a chisel blade made out of Musselshell. This is from a site on the gorge. It fractured long ways, but you can see it's basically half of one of these, and you can take a look at that if you want. But it's a super nicely made little object. It's pretty fast to make stuff out of Musselshell. It's like slate, and so what you give up for in durability, you gain in quickness of manufacture.
Maybe the last thing about the slate that we find at the Yumnuts is that it seems that we've got a couple of different shapes dominating. We have these kinds of more leaf-shaped objects or knife-shaped objects, and then we have all this really, really pointy stuff.
Yeah.
And what do you make of these really long, pointy...
Well, some of these are probably like works in progress. Okay, so that's one thing, is not everything you find archaeologically is finished. But something like this, I'd say, is on its way to being a projectile point. It may have broken during manufacture, or it may have come back to the camp inside the body of an animal.
Not so long. To me,
well,
to my eye, these things look extraordinary.
Yeah, so this one is, this is not typical, of course. It's a little atypical. It is super long. And, the longer you make something out of something brittle, the easier it is to snap in half. And, of course, this one is, in fact, snapped in half. So who knows? It might have been even longer. So there's, like this, you speculate that could be, like a three-pronged fish spear. This could be the central prong, which isn't going to take too much torque. It could be, for a little bit of show. You could imagine these could have been used for, in theory, for as alls or something, but this one doesn't have any of that kind of wear. So if it had been used for that, I think you'd know it. It's got a tiny little chip off the end. So barb for fishhook maybe, but again, I'm not sure it's the ideal material because lack of tensile strength, you know, and the barb takes a lot of weight on a bigger, and this would be a big fish hook, right? This would be, you know, barb of a halibut hook or something. Also the wrong style for down here, but, you know, okay. So the short answer is I don't really know, but something like this is, you know, it's been flaked, then it's going to get ground, and then maybe it's going to end up as something like this, but it's a work in progress. Yeah.
Jack and I noticed the other day at EMNS there's a fair bit of slate on site. Is it possible that there might have that tools might have been made out of slate that wouldn't have been otherwise simply because it was locally accessible, as opposed to like other materials are it's inland, so maybe other materials are not as available.
I think that, yeah, I think if you're sitting on top of the raw material, then maybe you use it, you know, slightly differently because you've got lots of it. The source or sources of the, you know, the fine slate used, you know, well, really throughout Salish Sea in particular. You know, there's reports that there's sources of big sheeting, sort of, you know, Welsh-style slate out in Jordan River, or Souk area. I've never heard of it up in the Cowichan Valley, but it's entirely possible. But, you know, it's different if you can get a little, if you get a little piece like this, that's fine for some things. But, you know, what you want for other things is a big piece like this. And sometimes you can see that it starts off thick, and then they want to make it thin, so reduce it by flaking. And the little flakes that come off are kind of archaeological nightmare because they don't retain the same diagnostic attributes as say, you know, like this flake would have had, or if, you know, flaked high-grade material. Yeah, like this piece of green shirt here. You know, the flakes that would have come off this, is any archaeologist could say that's definitely a flake that made deliberately by people to make an artifact, right? But the stuff that comes off slate is just like little planar bits. So it's not usually the case that you can say, oh, I found a little chip of slate that must have been a byproduct of making slate, flaked slate, or flaked to ground slate. But of course, if you start finding a bunch of flaked slate, and then you find a bunch of little flake bits, probably that's what's going on. And yeah, so I think some archaeologists are a little behind the curve on that still, you know, in that they don't recognize flaked slate at all unless it's like pokes them in the eye. And they're hostile to flaked slate debitage because it's ambiguous. And so they're like, well, the benefit of the doubt is we're going to be not collecting this, or they fall on the not collecting versus the collecting, because then they're like, well, what could we learn from it anyway? And of course, you don't really know until you collect a bunch of it.
So
yeah.
Maybe one of the last artifact types here we should talk about, recognizing the time for you, is the one that gets everybody the most excited about EMNuts, and it's the Obsidian. And you know, school kids, teachers, and grad students alike have all delighted in the Obsidian that's come from EMNuts. We found these 10 pieces back in '94, and just in our work, through the work we're doing right now, we found another 9 pieces this year. So, hell, you know, maybe we could talk about Obsidian.
Yeah, well, Obsidian, kind of volcanic glass. It forms typically by, you know, small, abrupt magma extrusions that cool really quickly. And faster it cools, the fewer crystals it has, whereas rock that cools really slowly will often have big, coarse crystals, and the minerals even can kind of start to separate out one from another. But this kind of cryptocrystalline or hidden crystal rock is ideal for making stone tools. It's essentially glassy, and very brittle, and also very controllable. So with all the secrets of making stone tools that are not available to me as being kind of a klutz, but it's a very homogeneous, uniform, brittle raw material that you can control very accurately, you know, with skill. So it lends itself to making very precisely shaped things. And it also, because of its nature of formation, it only has certain, you know, selected areas that it forms in. It's usually associated with volcanoes. So the main sources for it on the coast as a whole are south of the Columbia River in Oregon, where there's a number of sources, like glass buttes and whatchamacallit, caldera.
Who remembers where this one's from?
Newberry.
Newberry caldera, yeah. So Newberry caldera, there's a bank of obsidian that's, you know, as long as the business and economic buildings, a scree of obsidian, you know, boulders this big. But it has to get its way from Oregon to here, which is a long way even now. So it has, and then there's kind of some lousy obsidian at Mount Garibaldi, and there's some really nice obsidian in the western Chilcotin above the head of the Bella Coola Valley. There's a bit of obsidian that was probably only intermittently available up Kinkom Inlet. And then you have mounted Ziza in the far northwest of the province on the Stikine. So, you know, maybe 5 or 6 sources for the whole northwest coast. So it was probably had a lot of value, especially in a place like here, where you're about as far as you can get between the good sources, you know, Cowichan. And so it's an ideal material. People were willing to either go get it or trade for it. Either of those are expensive, you could say. And then, so once you have it, you tend not to just blow it apart with some hard hammer reduction or make some everyday tool out of it. And also, it's not that good for a lot of tools because it's too brittle. So like you wouldn't want to make, you know, a chopping tool out of this because it would blow apart. But one thing that repetitively comes up on the coast then is this particular genre of artifact making called microblade technology. And it's a whole prepared core thing. You have a core that is maybe about this big, and you prepare the face, and if this was obsidian, then you'd be able to start driving these very, you know, long in terms of length to width ratio, parallel-sided flakes off of the face, and each one would leave a very distinctive kind of fluted groove, and so you go along, tap, 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 tap. You make a bunch of these, and then the next pass, you've got the ridges from these to work with, and then you just work off those ridges, and you go tap, 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 tap. And now, so once you get it going, then in a matter of, like, you know, literally minutes, maybe 15 minutes, you could produce 50 of these, 100 of these. And once you have them, they're really excellent for composite tools. So they're be really awkward to use, like in your own hand. But because they're so sharp, if you can ally them to something that is less brittle, you can have the best of both worlds. So one common use for microblades then is if you make out of bone or wood or antler, if you make a long projectile point and put a groove into each side, like a long slot, you can glue these in. And I had a student do replication, and he found you could just chew spruce gum in your mouth, like straight off the tree, chew it in your mouth, makes it kind of wet and sticky, shove it in, shove the microblade in, and then within half an hour you couldn't even pull it out because it contracts around it as it's drying. So it's like, wow, that's easier than I thought it would be. I thought maybe you'd have to mix up some glue. But he showed you could do it just with spruce pitch. If you masticated it. So what you would have then would be a nice long projectile point that if, let's say it's made out of antler, which a lot of them are or were, then it's, you know, antler's an amazing raw material. It's really, really strong for tensile strength. And it's really strong for impact strength as well, and you can sharpen it. So you got the thing that pokes the hole in the animal, and then you got this row of razor blades that just lets the whole works just slide right into the animal, and it creates this giant hole in the animal. And I mean, no matter what kind of projectile you're using, that's, you know, the kind of grim goal of the exercise is poke a hole in the animal so the blood comes out, or poke a hole in the animal that goes through its heart or something. But anyway, you want to poke a hole, and the bigger and wider and more damaging the hole, the better. So it takes a lot of work, expertise, and, you know, in this case, exotic material to create a slotted point. So you're front-loading a huge amount of labor, but the benefit is that you have a super lethal weapon that, especially, like, let's say that you're in a situation where you might not have as many encounters with game as you would like maybe you're using these for hunting sea mammals, and you're like, wow, back in the day we used to see, you know, sea lions every day, and now we're only seeing them every week. So when you do see one once a week, you want to be able to nail it. And so at that point, it's worth the front load to give yourself the best possible chance. Yes?
Those are projectiles, the weapons you're talking about?
Yeah.
Is that tools?
Yeah, so well, that's one thing you can do with these. Another thing you can do with them is make little knives. So, you know, I was talking about Jesse Morin's experiments with ground slate and stuff, and finding he couldn't, once he broke the skin of the fish, then he could deal with the fish with his replicated knife. And so what he ended up doing, and this could be real, and there's reasons to believe it may be real in some places, was he basically had two knives. So he had his replica, you know, Cortex Spall tool or Musselshell knife, and he had a little scalpel-like device made out of a microblade or some very hard and sharp material. And so he'd just take that, he'd use this tool to just go make a nick, put that one down, pick up his Cortex Spall tool, and then do the rest of the fish like that. So this is so sharp and just able to just get right into the fish skin. And like I say, once you've got it started, then you can cut it with almost anything. So little knives, and they've been found in their hafts at certain archaeological sites, especially Hoko River, which is similar in age to this site, and just across the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And it's a site with a lot of waterlogged material, so you find things like stone tools that are still in their handles. And there they had dozens of little knives about this long. The typical thing was to have, okay, so if the knife is this long, they start with a piece of cedar about this long, which is about the size, about the width and thickness of a popsicle stick. So it's like a long popsicle stick, then they crease it in the middle, and that enables them to fold it like this. So then the part that is folded, that's where they put in a little blade of some kind, and then they wrap it up with cherry bark. So cherry bark was just the favorite thing for doing wrapping. You find it all over and way back. So wrapped with cherry bark, and you can probably make one of these knives in, like if you're skilled, you can make it in a minute. And so what you can do then is make a whole bunch of semi-disposable little knives, and when they were, and these were easily lost or even just discarded when they got dull. And so the Hoko River site is full of them with their little blades, and some of which are microblades, and some of which are just bits of vein quartz smashed by bipolar, producing just little sharp bits that, again, in a normal archaeological site, that's the only piece you'd find. A lot of archaeologists would just be like, that's not an artifact. But there they are mounted in their system, and you can see they're only 5% of the total tool, and it's a kind of tool that you can make so quickly and expediently that they become almost then kind of like disposable. So you're not wasting, hours making this thing. You're spending, you make half an hour, you make 10 of them, And then you got your little stash of X-Acto knives, which, last you for a few weeks, and then eventually you make a few more. But if you lose one, it's no big deal.
The supply from Oregon.
Well, that's the thing. So some of those are made with Microblades and Obsidian Oregon, and some of them are just made with just little bits of locally available beach pebbles of vein quartz smashed up. So
It's a little chert one with the residue on it.
yeah,
Residue.
yeah. So this is, although superficially this looks like it's the red, or I think what they call mahogany obsidian, which is very distinctive of Oregon, but not all Oregon obsidian is red. Like this is all probably Oregon obsidian, and most of it's not red. And we got a big chunk of it around somewhere, don't we? Oh yeah, free pieces. So don't think that because I had this out the other day and it feels waxy. I think it's chert, which is a silica-rich rock that forms in limestone, and you can even if you want to hold this and just rub your hand on it in a place where it's detached, like right there where it's got smooth, you can feel it's a bit waxy to the touch. Like it's quite a distinctive texture. And this has got some kind of residue on it, little black bits of organic residue. So you could take this to like a mass spectrometer lab. They could take this off with toluene or something, make a sample, put it in the mass spec, probably have to tell you what it is.
Spruce pitch or
Yeah,
might be.
it could easily be, could easily be spruce pitch or pine. And in places where they've done that, like the ice patches in the southern Yukon and southern NWT, they've analyzed, because they've got projectiles with microblades slotted in them still, and with the glue still as part of the system, and shown that it is in fact just basically tree sap that's holding them in, and they can tell that from it being mass spec'd. Yeah. So that's cool, and much like, the obsidian's really cool because you know for sure where it's coming from. You chemically fingerprint it, it's unequivocal, and if you fingerprinted the sources, then you can know exactly where that comes from. Most of these rock types on the coast are not like that, so the chert, like that green chert that's going around, it's like there's a couple of places where people know that chert exists. It's probably, there's a lot of it in glacial till, but we don't know, that's the mother lode of green chert where people went to get chert. Equally, we don't know, well, where did they go to get slate? And it would make a difference if there was only one place versus everywhere, just in terms of thinking about ancient trade patterns, social interaction, who owned what, who had the right to do what, and so forth. So, progress is being made in an archaeological sense slowly in identifying other rock types than obsidian, because obsidian is super low-hanging fruit. Other ones are more challenging, and we're not super far along that. But it has, once you can figure that out, you have such potential for understanding the movement of stuff around the landscape, because this stuff doesn't move by itself. So if you can show that there's limited range of sources, like on the central coast, there's greenstone, which is like a milky version of this, not as good. But anyway, there's a source for that in Kimsquit Inlet, and as far as we know, all the greenstone celts on the whole central coast are made out of that one source, and so that gives you, like, again, an idea. People must have gone there to get it, people must have had the right to go there to get it, or people must have had social relations with the people who owned it that you could trade for it, and then you start to wonder, well, what did they give up to get it back? And it introduces this whole world of social networking traced through stone tools. So to the extent that we're able to, apply kind of archaeological science, the goal of that is to understand social relationships, from just, because as archaeologists, we start with the stuff that's in the ground, and then we take additional information where we can get it, ideally community-based, local ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge, but also what we can learn through archaeological science. And of course, once you go back a few thousand years, at some point you enter into technologies that have not been known on the coast for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. And it's, it's not that you wouldn't learn something by talking to somebody who knew a lot about kind of traditional manufacturing, but it's a bit insulting almost to think, well, that person's going to know what that 3,000-year-old tool is or for, because, it's like, history happens. Cultures change, technology change, innovations are made, things come in and out of style. And so, sometimes you need to bring in, a bigger picture, comparisons with elsewhere in the world, chemical analyses, residue analysis, whatever, to complete the picture. Yeah.
So stepping back and just looking at this all as a whole, does this collection of artifacts tell you anything about Yumnuts, the site itself? Is there anything info for you here? The narrative of the site, of course, is that very long ago there's this odd feature A where there's some burning and we're not sure exactly what's going on, maybe canoe manufacture, canvas preparation, or what. And then there's a structure that we find on the site, and a lot of this is coming out at the same time as the structure. And then following that, it stopped seeming to be used in that way, and there's more of a cemetery. And none of this is from the funerary objects.
Well, okay, one thing that's striking is there's very little flaked stone. So you've got microblades, and that's a high skill flaked stone. Like, you need a lot of skill. You have to be an experienced napper to make those. And yet, when I look at this, and I don't know exactly what's not here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 maybe, pieces of flaked stone. And normally in an archaeological assemblage of this time period, you'd expect about half the stuff that comes out of the ground to be flaked stone, flaked stone debitage of one kind or another. So, okay, so that's striking. So there's a lot of manufacturing debris, I would say, manufacturing debris and blown up failed attempts at making stuff out of ground slate, an unusually large amount. So there's a couple of nice pieces that are finished, and then there's a lot of stuff that's, so, and a large number of ablator stones relative to the assemblage as a whole. So ablator stones, good for making ground slate, good for making ground bone, potentially good sometimes for grinding wood. But here you got quite a bit of ground bone, quite a bit of ground slate. You've got these microblades as a kind of exotic anomaly. So like, this is a backward site. Like, if your number one, lithics are microblades and not generic bits of coastal volcanics, that's weird. So I'm just kind of thinking my way through that. And then you've got these, you've got dentalia. So you've got at least 2 dentalia, and again, these are an exotic shell that held, at least historically, a lot of value, and were traded widely, traded as far as the Mississippi from the west coast, and found up and down the coast, and were, like, not exactly a kind of, cryptocurrency, but there was something that had value and that people wanted. So what's that doing there? And I know there's a lot of burials there.
From a different time period.
From a different time period, okay. So I think, it's a place where, okay, so people wanted to make a lot of stuff out of slate, out of bone. So like 80% of this assemblage is ground slate, ground bone, and ablator stones. So that's off the charts. So, I wouldn't say, though, that it's necessarily like a place where you manufactured stuff just for its own purposes, because why would you? It doesn't sound like there's, it sounds like there's some slate there, but, of course, there's going to be more land mammals up in the valley than there are down on the coast. But I suspect then that they're using tools, these tools there. So these I would generically say many of these are involved in fish processing, and the microblades may be involved in fish processing as well, and then these awls involved either in leatherworking or basketry, and those could also go along with fishing. We're making traps, baskets, lines, cords, the whole paraphernalia that you need. Now, having said that, and without having looked at this, you've got those toggling harpoons, a bunch of manufacturing waste, and a few obvious awls. So, yeah. I'd say, most likely fishing, fish processing, making your sites, making your tools in situ, having maybe some little opening knives. Everything about it is consistent with Locarno Beach. I don't see any real outliers here that would need to be explained. And so the assemblage as a whole is, even the ground slate is mostly faceted versus dome-shaped, so it's, it's kind of hexagonal in cross-section. That's Locarno. So, yeah. And this cell is classic Locarno. So I wouldn't say you would never find one in a later assemblage, but, they started off, the first ones in Locarno, because that's the first time you get this kind of artifact on the coast, well, except in Haida Gwaii. But first ones they made were the best, like in terms of manufacturing and aesthetics and cleanness and finish, and Locarno as a whole, has this almost, with their finished tools, very, very tidy, neat, relatively small, well-made, kind of, sort of like a shaker aesthetic going on, at a kind of holistic level. And then Marpole stuff gets big and expedient, and then in more recent times, things kind of like a melange of the two, I guess you could say, but Locarno assemblages are really distinctive, yeah. So to me, this all fits, but probably used for many things, but those would be, I would say, the main activity would be focusing around something to do with fish.
And of course, given that we're only seeing stone and bone here, this is what, 5% or 3% or 1% of the whole assemblage that would have been there.
Yeah, definitely.
In that
So
it doesn't preserve much.
no, so it's So the material culture, you do have to project onto it. Imagine that here there's like a big pile of beautiful baskets, and that here there's like coils of rope and fishing line and leather braiding, leather stuff, and that there's capes and hats and the whole works. Houses. So yeah, as archaeologists sometimes we're like, oh, this thing must have mattered so much, but really is, a means to an end, or just a completely unimportant part of the day. And, because, we just don't see the full expression of material culture. And, for archaeologists historically, that's been a slippery slope to, bad interpretation, as people that didn't have very much going on and that probably didn't have very advanced ideas about anything, because look at this tool, hit rock, so there's been a little bit of that worldwide with archaeology, and then I think we're learning to overcome that a little bit.
Well, I really appreciate you giving an impromptu rock talk today.
Okay.
It's an awesome collection.
Yeah, okay.
Thank Quentin for this talk.
Thank you for having me, and
If people have one-on-one questions some other day, some other time, they can knock on your door.
what time is it now?
Yeah.
It's time to go.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks again.
yeah.
The shelf blade.
Oh,
It's not from this.
Can I give you back this? Okay. And there's some, I put the other thing back.